Thought I'd just kind of step inside the shoes of a dandy, because I'm pretty sure Oscar Wilde would roll over in his grave if I showed up in a simple pantsuit. So, last semester, I participated in a fascinating study on the comedy of matters tradition with my fellow panelists as we closely examined a wide range of plays from 19th and 20th century British drama. While exploring the works of renowned playwrights Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw, I became intrigued by their shrewd insight into the social construct of Victorian etiquette, which dictates feminine purity yet seems to excuse male depravity, despite their different social affiliations. For my presentation, I will discuss how both playwrights demonstrate different perspectives of Victorian sexual morality through various portrayals of women, as informed by their own views on social conventions. In the wake of his social purity movement to outlaw male lust, the ever-salacious Wilde explores sexual politics in the seduction of his female protagonists, specifically Miss Arbuthnot in A Woman of No Importance, and Lady Windermere in Lady Windermere's Fan, to suggest the futility of an ethical hierarchy that condones the sexual crimes of men at the expense of female purity. However, Shaw further denounces this degradation of women as an advocate of women's rights in his development of authoritative female characters, such as Vivie Warren in Miss Warren's Profession and Gloria Clarendon in You Never Can Tell, who claim dominance in both domestic and public spheres. Whereas Wilde merely exposes this double moral standard as his female protagonists risk public shame due to male vice, Shaw actively condemns patriarchal edicts of proper womanhood and promotes sexual tolerance through various representations of the self-respecting woman. As a notoriously extravagant dandy who thrived in high society, Wilde tested a hypocritical moral hierarchy, which social purists strove to reform in the 19th century through his own sexually transgressive behavior. Though Wilde refused to support this movement against the sexual crimes of men, British journalist and social activist W.T. Stead observed how criminal charges of gross indecency against the playwright exposed discriminatory moral values perpetuated in Victorian society. In his essay, The Conviction of Oscar Wilde, Stead rationalizes Wilde's lewd homosexual exploits upon his hearing in 1895 and asserts that the social persecution of his deviant behavior sheds light on accepted moral standards that tolerate equally lecherous crimes of heterosexual men when he claims, if Oscar Wilde, instead of indulging in dirty tricks of indecent familiarity with boys and men, had ruined the lives of half a dozen innocent simpletons of girls, or had broken up the home of his friend by corrupting his friend's wife, no one could have laid a finger upon him. The male is sacrosanct, the female is fair game. Indicating oppressive demands for female purity under patriarchal authority, Stead argues that the established hierarchy of sexual morality often overlooks similar acts of sexual deviance that were committed by men and instead exploited women. As he inadvertently calls into question this double moral standard with crimes of homosexual lust, Wilde further examined the need for a universal code of ethics through the dramatic action of his societal comedies, which uphold the arbitrary decorum of characters who exist among the Victorian elite. In his modern plays, Wilde constructs brief moral conflicts for his female protagonists that merely assess oppressive standards of female purity under a depraved patriarchy. While examining the evolution of his righteous female characters, Gregory Mackey claims that Wilde portrays the dramatic action of his plays only to analyze the moral outlooks of these women. As he states, the process of moral evaluation, however, is limited by its being confined to a field of binaries and dualistic terms, and character development in these comedies is ultimately subject to a relatively firm ethical and verbal typology. As the playwright assesses the ethical position of his female protagonists, Mackey argues that Wilde limits the development of their characters with a binary code of ethics that refrains from obstructing the hypocritical hierarchy of sexual morality. In exploring the social struggles of Miss Arbuthnot as a victim of male vice in his play, A Woman of No Importance, Wilde restricts her bout of moral enlightenment to dualistic expectations of female purity and male depravity as she endures public condemnation for her weakness in the face of seduction. When she confronts her seducer, Lord Illingsworth, after years of public shame, Arbuthnot pleads that he leave their love child in her custody and bemoans, "I have had 20 years of sorrow, and I have only had one thing to love me, only one thing to love. You have had a life of joy and pleasure and success. You have been quite happy. You have never thought of us." As she tries to inform Illingsworth that his lecherous actions defamed her reputation, Miss Arbuthnot notes how the wicked dandy continues to thrive in high society despite his similar sexual transgressions. Establishing her status as a fallen woman, Miss Arbuthnot acknowledges the existence of a paradoxical moral hierarchy as she laments her social ostracism due to her submission to male vice, which allows Illingsworth to maintain prominence among the social elite. Though she first mourns her scorned position outside of Victorian high society, Miss Arbuthnot refuses her son's plea to marry her seducer in an attempt to salvage her reputation and insists that, "I am disgraced." He is not. That is all. It is the usual history of a man as a woman and a woman as it usually happens, as it always happens. And the ending is the ordinary ending. The woman suffers, the man goes free. Providing insight into a discriminatory code of ethics that is imposed upon men and women, Miss Arbuthnot seems to come to terms with her status as a fallen woman who exists outside of a hypocritical moral hierarchy when she rejects social expectations of convenient marriage to proclaim purity. Although her enlightened character chooses to preserve her dignity over her reputation, Arbuthnot ultimately eludes an active stance against this degradation of women and allows acts of male vice to persist under the construct of sexual morality. Thus, Wilde refrains from disturbing the rigid social structure, which perpetuates oppressive standards of female purity, through the fleeting moral conflict of the women in his plays, and, in turn, exposes this double standard of Victorian morality. Wilde further evaluates the paradoxical nature of Victorian ethics in the witty discourse of his male and female characters, which provokes the vexing moral dilemma of his female protagonists while maintaining arbitrary decorum. According to Mackey, Wilde juxtaposes notions of good and bad through the epigrammatic language of his morally dubious characters, including the seemingly nefarious dandy Lord Darlington in his play Lady Windermere's Fan, to establish equilibrium between these disparate concepts and affirm the presence of a hypocritical moral hierarchy. In his clever exchange with Lady Windermere, the play's righteous protagonist who expresses her belief in a universal moral standard when given a presumably hypothetical case of infidelity, Darlington mocks the institution of Victorian etiquette when he quips, "It is absurd to divide people into good and bad. People are either charming or tedious," creating a dual disparity between ethical behavior and social bearing in these epigrams. Darlington undermines contemporary moral values and further suggests the futile existence of an ethical binary in high society. Once their characters test expectations of sexual purity through this witty discourse, Lady Windermere finds herself caught in a moral discrepancy when she must choose between the forbidden love of Darlington and her rightful duty to her allegedly adulterous husband. As she weighs the consequences of her own infidelity for fear of public condemnation, Lady Windermere questions social demands for female purity when she laments, "And yet which is the worst, I wonder, to be at the mercy of a man who leaves one, or the wife of a man who in one's own house dishonors one? What woman knows? What woman in the world?" At the pinnacle of her moral conflict, Lady Windermere internalizes this lexical opposition between virtue and Victorian etiquette and further perpetuates Darlington's notion of a worthless ethical hierarchy that condones male depravity. Even though she moves to disrupt this moral double standard, Lady Windermere refrains from challenging its oppressive structure by reassessing her personal code of ethics once the play's dramatic action reaches its stunted resolution. Through the marginal development of his female protagonist's moral conflict, which is spawned from their epigrammatic dialogue, Wilde preserves arbitrary decorum among the Victorian elite and, in turn, upholds this double standard of sexual purity. Whereas Wilde merely tested the paradoxical construct of Victorian morality, George Bernard Shaw worked to overturn such oppressive demands for ideal womanhood through his social activism in the 19th century. As a major proponent of the Fabian socialist movement, Shaw believed that both men and women should work to improve society due to their equal levels of human potential. According to Chauvian scholar Sally Peters, the playwright urged for equal rights among the sexes in response to the lack of female involvement within the public sphere at the expense of social change. To promote the gradual reform of patriarchal demands for proper womanhood, Shaw scrutinized such discriminatory edicts of Victorian morality through his works of modern drama to support his campaign for sexual equality. In the development of provocative discussion plays, Shaw openly condemns the social construct of ideal womanliness in the final resolution of their dramatic action, which spawns from the moral conflict of his defiant, authoritative female characters. As expressed in his essay, The Womanly Woman, Shaw argues that patriarchal expectations of female responsibility in both domestic and public spheres deprive women of their individual rights as equal members of society, and maintains that woman has to repudiate duty altogether. In that repudiation lies her freedom, for it is false to say that woman is now directly the slave of man. She is the immediate slave of duty. By urging Victorian women to renounce noble, self-sacrificing duty and assert their independence under the patriarchy, Shaw fosters the concept of an empowered, self-reliant woman who thrives in contemporary society, which he further illustrates through strong-willed female characters. By ascribing typically masculine traits to his determined protagonist, Vivie Warren, in the play Miss Warren's Profession, Shaw establishes her autonomous female character among men in the public sphere in such a way that undermines expectations of her rightful duty to the household. After the influential Sir George Crofts offers her financial stability and high social standing through marriage, Vivi declines his proposal and the leisures of high society when she states, "I am much obliged to you for being so definite and businesslike. I quite appreciate the offer, the money, the position, Lady Crofts, and so on, but I think I will say no if you don't mind. I'd rather not." Though the insincere gentleman tries to appeal to her pragmatic character with forthright terms for a marriage of convenience, Vivi rejects this call to her domestic duty as a woman so that she may focus on advancing in the working world and achieve her own economic means. When she later faces scrutiny from Praed and Frank Gardner for her austere, unromantic character, Vivi dismisses their insistence on her sentimental, domesticated nature as a woman and asserts that, "You are welcome to any illusions you may have left on these subjects. I have none. If we three are to remain friends, I must be treated as a woman of business, permanently single and permanently unromantic." Resisting the male influences that intrude upon her space in the public sphere, Vivi discredits their expectations of her duties as a pious woman and a doting wife by upholding her proclivity for self-reliance, which contests Victorian standards of love and marriage. Although she may not seem to triumph over patriarchal authority as she fulfills her noble duty as businesswoman under dominant males of the working world, Vivi still asserts her independence after enduring oppressive demands for proper womanhood, which drove her own mother to engage in sordid business, so that she may earn her own respectable income. Rather than restrict his female protagonist to a binary of Victorian morality, as illustrated in Wilde's plays, Shaw fully explores their moral conflict to the point where their characters subvert conventions of ideal womanliness and claim authority in patriarchal society. Despite the fact that he portrays several female protagonists in a conventional domestic role, Shaw modifies his conception of an independent, authoritative woman through the dramatic action that unfolds in the household to closely scrutinize and subvert patriarchal standards of ideal femininity. When he considers the helpless circumstances of Victorian wives, Shaw upholds that women must assume a matriarchal position over their domestic domain to reclaim their dignity, and reasons that the self-respect she has lost as a wife she regains as a mother, in which capacity her use and importance for the community compare favorably with those of most men of business. By attaining authority within a household that thrives on their selfless duty, Shaw argues that women can undermine oppressive standards of ideal domesticity that demean their natural womanhood, and in turn regain a sense of autonomy and self-worth through dominance. In the development of his female protagonist, Gloria Clarendon, in the comedic play You Never Can Tell, Shaw illustrates this notion of female empowerment through domestic duty as her strong-minded character elicits her command over the institution of Victorian marriage. As she struggles to protect her strong convictions from the lustful bachelor, Mr. Valentine, Gloria laments her lack of moral strength after she kisses him and admits that, "I am one of those weak creatures born to be mastered by the first man whose eye is caught by them, and I must fulfill my destiny, I suppose." By conceding to her supposedly natural sentimentality as a woman, Gloria appears to revoke her self-reliant identity and succumb to patriarchal expectations of passive womanhood as she reluctantly pursues a love affair with her male counterpart. Once she learns that Valentine earns meager wages as a dentist, Gloria aggressively embraces her suitor and takes it upon herself to propose marriage when she declares, "Now let us have no false delicacy. Tell my mother that we have agreed to marry one another." Knowing that this irresistible bachelor holds weak economic standing, Gloria moves to acquire control over Valentine through marriage so that she may reclaim her self-respect as a morally upright, autonomous wife in the household. Although she seems to compromise her self-reliant character in assuming a domestic role, Gloria ultimately redeems the weakness of her principles while she gains dominance over a financially unstable patriarch and asserts her independence. Thus, Shaw resolves the moral struggles of his authoritative, albeit conflicted, female protagonists who face oppressive standards of ideal womanliness to suggest the rightful independence of women from their matriarchal authority in the household. Though both playwrights illustrate patriarchal demands for proper womanhood in Victorian society, Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw conveyed divergent perspectives on the social construct of sexual morality through different magnitudes of dramatic action that developed their female protagonists. Considering his own immoral behavior as a hedonistic dandy in high society, Wilde restrains the moral conflict of righteous women in his plays to maintain arbitrary decorum in a paradoxical ethical hierarchy and only works to expose this moral double standard. Conversely, Shaw explores the social struggles of his strong-willed, autonomous female characters to subvert expectations of ideal womanliness and further encourage social reform for women's rights. As Wilde avoids disrupting the established code of Victorian ethics, which would overlook his crimes of gross indecency in a heterosexual context, and confines the development of his female characters to a binary of sexual morality, Shaw actively thwarts patriarchal demands for female purity and domestic duty to promote sexual equality in various portrayals of authoritative women who thrive in both domestic and public spheres. Thank you.
I should have announced at the beginning, we'll take a few minutes of questions after each, if there are any, after each presenter. I will police that unceremoniously so that neither of the other presenters feels rushed. But any comments at this point? At the end, we can open up to whether comments or questions remain thereafter. Going once.